I didn't pack a suitcase. I didn't leave a note. I just sat at my kitchen table in Mississauga with a cup of tea that had gone cold, listening to the sound of my son-in-law's truck pulling out of my driveway, and I thought, this is the last time that man will ever set foot on my property. It took me 63 years to learn that patience is not the same thing as permission. I learned it the hard way. My daughter came into my life as a surprise, not unwanted, never unwanted, but unexpected. I was 22, working the front desk at a dental clinic on her Ontario, and her father and I had been together less than a year. We made it work for a while. Then we didn't. By the time she was 4, it was just the two of us in a rented duplex in Port Credit, and I was picking up weekend shifts at a grocery store so the lights would stay on. I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you so you understand what that little girl meant to me. She was everything. She was the reason I went back to school at 31, got my accounting certificate, built something steady. Everything I did with her in mind. Her name is Stephanie. I called her Steph, mostly. She was bright and funny and so much like me when she was young. Stubborn in the best way. The kind of stubborn that gets things done. I watched her grow up and I was proud every single day, even when she was difficult, even when she was a teenager and we fought about things I can't even remember now. The love never wavered. Not once. She met Marcus when she was 28. She brought him to Sunday dinner at my place in November. I remember because I'd made a turkey and the weather had turned early, first real cold snap of the season. He shook my hand and said all the right things. Complimented the food, asked about my work, helped clear the table without being asked. I thought, okay, this one has manners. I liked him. I want to be honest about that. I genuinely liked him at the start. They moved in together after 6 months. Engaged within the year, the wedding was in September, out at a vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake. A beautiful day, warm for that late in the summer, and I stood in the back of the ceremony and cried in a way that had nothing to do with sadness. She was happy. She was absolutely radiant. That was all I ever wanted for her. Things started to shift slowly. That's the thing about slow shifts. You don't feel them in the moment. You only understand them when you look back. The first thing I noticed was how quiet Steph got on the phone. When she was younger, she'd call me and talk for 40 minutes about nothing. Work, a show she was watching, something funny that happened at the pharmacy where she worked as a technician. After she married Marcus, those calls got shorter, then less frequent. When I asked if everything was okay, she'd say yes, she was just busy. They were both busy. I told myself that was normal. Newlyweds settling in, building their life. I didn't push. Marcus had started his own landscaping company a couple of years before they met. It did reasonably well in the summers. Winters were always lean. Steph's income carried them through the cold months, and I knew that arrangement created stress, though nobody said it out loud. I helped when I could. A few $100s here and there when a bill was due. I didn't case, chat at tables with a cup of tea that tend want to. She was my daughter. In the spring of the year, they'd been married almost 3 years. Steph called me on a Tuesday evening. Marcus had a chance to expand. A second truck, another crew, some commercial contracts in Brampton that could change everything for the business. The problem was the deposit on the equipment. They were short $18,000. She asked if I could help. I had that money. I'd been careful my whole adult life, never spent beyond my means, maxed my RSP contributions when I could, bought my house in Mississauga back when the market was something a person like me could actually participate in. That money was sitting in a savings account, earmarked loosely for my own retirement. But I looked at my daughter's voice on the other end of the phone. I know you can't see a voice, but somehow with Steph, I always could, and I said yes. I transferred the money the following Friday. No contract, no repayment schedule. I thought about drawing something up and then felt embarrassed by the thought. She was my daughter. He was my son-in-law. You don't do paperwork with family. The business grew that summer. Marcus hired 3 guys, landed the Brampton contracts, and by August, he was talking about buying a property, a house, their first house. They'd been renting in Oakville and the landlord was selling, so the timing was right. The market was brutal, as it always is in the GTA, and they needed help with the down payment. He called me himself that time. Marcus, not Steph. That should have registered. He said they were looking at a place in Burlington, a semi-detached 4 bedrooms, good school district for when the time comes, he said, and I remember he laughed a little when he said it. They needed $40,000 to get to 20% and avoid the CMHC premium. Could I help? I said I needed to think about it. He said, of course, take your time. I talked to Steph that evening and she said it would really make a difference. I slept on it for 3 nights. Then I called my financial advisor, a woman I'd been working with for years out of a Scotiabank branch in Streetsville, and she told me plainly that I was drawing down my retirement savings significantly and that I should be sure. I was sure. She was my daughter. He was the father of the grandchildren I assumed were coming. I transferred the $40,000. They got the house, moved in October. I helped them paint the living room on a Saturday, and Marcus made a big show of putting my name on a piece of paper he called the Family Investor Wall, which was just a joke, a handwritten thing taped inside a kitchen cabinet. I laughed. I thought it was sweet. I want to tell you exactly when I first felt something was wrong in a way I couldn't explain away. It was the following March. I'd driven out to Burlington for dinner. Steph had invited me, said she was making a roast. Come at 6. I got there at 5:50 and let myself in with the key she'd given me. Marcus was in the kitchen and I startled him. He turned around and there was a look on his face for just half a second before he arranged it into a smile that I had never seen before. It wasn't surprise. It was something colder than that. He said, "You should really call before you come over." I said Steph had invited me for dinner. He said, "I know, but still, it's our home." I didn't say anything. I set my coat on the chair and started unwrapping the wine I'd brought, and I told myself he'd had a hard day. The winter had been slow for the business. Let it go. Steph came downstairs a few minutes later and the evening was fine, but I drove home that night with something sitting in my chest that I couldn't name. Over the next several months, the visits became more structured, less spontaneous. Marcus mentioned once, casually, not aggressively, just casually, that it would be easier if I gave more notice. Then he mentioned it again. Then Steph started prefacing invitations with, "I'll just check with Marcus first." I began to feel like a guest who needed to book an appointment to see her own daughter. Steph came to me alone one afternoon in the fall, met me for coffee at a Tim Hortons near my office. She seemed tired in a way I hadn't seen before. Not just physically. Something behind her eyes. I asked her directly, "Is everything okay with you two?" She said yes. She said Marcus was under pressure with the business. Some contracts hadn't renewed. The second truck was costing more to maintain than expected. She said he just needed space. I asked her if she was happy and she looked at her coffee cup for a moment before she said yes. I didn't believe her, but I didn't push. I don't know if that was wisdom or cowardice. I've thought about it many times since. Christmas that year was at their place in Burlington. It was me, Steph, Marcus, and his mother Sandra, who drove up from Hamilton. Sandra was a pleasant woman, easy to talk to, and I remember thinking it was a perfectly ordinary Christmas dinner. Turkey, stuffing, the good wine I'd brought. After dessert, Marcus's phone rang and he excused himself. He was gone for almost 30 minutes. When he came back, he was quiet. Sandra left early. Steph started clearing dishes with a quickness that meant she didn't want to make eye contact. In the car on my way home, I called Steph from hands-free and asked if she was all right. She said yes. I said, "Steph, you can tell me anything." Long pause. Then, "I know, Mom. Then I'll call you tomorrow." She didn't call the next day. Or the day after. I called her on the third day and she answered and sounded completely normal, laughing about something at work, asking about my neighbor's cat. I let myself believe it was fine. That's what you do when you love someone. You let yourself believe. The money conversation came in February, not from Steph this time. Marcus called me on a Wednesday night, and I could hear from his voice that he'd been building up to this. The business was in trouble. The commercial contracts had all gone to a larger company that had undercut him on price. He owed money on the equipment, the second truck he'd bought with my $18,000 among other things. He needed $25,000 among other things. He needed $25,000 to restructure the debt, or he'd have to shut down. I said I didn't have it. He said he thought I'd want to help Steph. I said I had already helped Steph. Substantially. There was a pause. Then he said, "I'm talking to you as family, Diane." I said I understood that and I was talking to him as family too. And the answer was no. I didn't have $25,000 to give. And even if I had, I couldn't keep drawing down my retirement to cover business losses. I said it gently. I said I was sorry the business was struggling. He hung up. Steph called an hour later, and she sounded strained and apologetic, and she said Marcus was upset and she was sorry he'd called me directly. She said they would figure it out. I told her I loved her and I was always there for her personally, whatever she needed personally. She said she knew. I didn't hear from Marcus for 6 weeks. Steph and I spoke, but the calls were short. She said things were fine. The business situation was being sorted out. Then came the Saturday in April. I had driven out to Burlington because Steph had asked me to bring some boxes. She'd asked if I still had the good wardrobe boxes from when I'd moved because they were reorganizing a closet. Normal request. Normal Saturday. I pulled into their driveway at 11 in the morning and Steph met me at the door. She looked like she hadn't slept. I carried the boxes in and set them in the hallway. Marcus was in the kitchen. He didn't say hello. I walked to the kitchen doorway and said good morning. He turned around and looked at me with an expression I had never in my life had directed at me. Not contempt exactly. Something past contempt. Like I was an inconvenience he'd been tolerating for too long. He said, "You know your problem, Diane. You think money makes you relevant." I stood very still. He said, "You gave us money, and now you think you have a say." "You don't have a say. This is our house." I said quietly that I had never asked for a say. He said, "You show up whenever you want. You call constantly. You undermine me with my wife." I said I called my daughter, not him. And then, and I need you to understand that I am not dramatizing this, I am telling you what happened. He stepped toward me in that kitchen and he jabbed his finger about 4 inches from my face and he said, "Stay out of our life." Steph was in the hallway. I looked at her. She was pressed against the wall with her arms crossed over her chest and she was not looking at me. I picked up my keys from the counter. I said, very quietly, "I'll see myself out." I sat in my car in their driveway for a while. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there with my hands on the wheel and I thought about the $58,000. Not with anger exactly, more with a clarity that felt like cold water. $58,000 I had given to this man who had just jabbed his finger in my face in front of my daughter, who stood against the wall and said nothing. I drove home. I called Steph that evening. It went to voicemail. I called the next morning. Voicemail. I sent a text that said, "I love you. I'm here when you're ready. Please just let me know you're okay." She replied 4 hours later with, "I'm fine." That was all. 3 days later, I called a lawyer. Not because I'd decided anything yet, because I needed to understand my options. I needed someone to tell me what was real. Her name was Patricia Ossie, and she practiced family and estate law out of a firm in downtown Mississauga. I'd been referred to her by a colleague. I sat across from her on a Tuesday afternoon and I told her everything. The $18,000, the $40,000, no written agreement either time. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked me a few questions in a very calm, professional way. She said, "You understand that without documentation, these transfers are considered gifts under Canadian law." I said I understood. She said, "There's very little legal recourse for recovering gifted funds." I said, "I'm not here about the money." She looked at me. I said, "I'm here about the money." She looked at me. I said, "I'm here about my will." I had made a will 11 years earlier, standard document, everything to Steph, with some charitable bequests to a literacy organization I'd supported for years. I had a house in Mississauga that, given what the GTA market had done in the intervening decade, was worth considerably more than I'd paid for it. I had my RRSP, my TFSA, my pension from the firm I'd worked at for 19 years. It was not a small estate. I told Patricia I wanted to restructure everything. She walked me through the options. I could leave the house directly to Steph with specific conditions, or I could place it in a trust with terms. I could restructure beneficiary designations on the registered accounts. I could establish a family trust that would protect assets from a spouse's claims in the event of separation, which exists under Ontario law in certain structures. We met 3 more times over the following 2 weeks. I was thorough. I was calm. I signed the new documents on a Thursday afternoon, and Patricia's assistant witnessed them, and I walked out of that office into a gray April afternoon, and I felt something I can only describe as my own spine returning to my body. I did not tell Steph immediately. I thought about it, but I knew that if I told her while she was still under that roof, it would get back to Marcus, and Marcus would either escalate or maneuver. I needed her out of that situation first, or at least I needed to leave a door open that she could walk through herself. The door came in June. Steph called me on a Sunday evening, and this time she didn't sound strained. She sounded like someone who had been underwater and had just broken the surface. She said she'd had a conversation with her doctor, her family doctor, whom she'd been seeing for 15 years, and the doctor had referred her to a counselor. She said she hadn't told Marcus. She said she didn't know what was happening in her marriage, but she knew she wasn't okay. I didn't leave a note in Mississauga. Come home. She said, "What?" I said, "Come here. Stay with me. As long as you need. The room is there." She came the following Friday with 2 bags and her cat. Marcus called me twice that evening. I didn't answer. He sent a text that said, "You always do this." I didn't respond. The weeks that followed were quiet. Steph saw her counselor twice a week. She went to work. She slept in her old room, and sometimes on Saturday mornings I'd come downstairs and she'd already have the coffee on, and we'd sit at the kitchen table like it was 15 years ago, before everything, and just be together. Those mornings meant more to me than I can say. She filed for separation in August. Marcus did not take it well. There were calls, there were long messages, There was a period of 3 weeks where he showed up at my house twice unannounced, once in the evening, once on a Sunday afternoon. Both times I stood at the door and told him Steph wasn't available. Both times I was calm, and both times my heart was going very fast. The second time he came on a Sunday, he stood on my front step and said, with a kind of quiet fury, "You poisoned her against me. Everything was fine before you." I said, "Everything was not fine." He said, "I'm going to get what she owes me, what you both owe me." I said, "You should speak with your lawyer about that." His lawyer did eventually send a letter. Steph's lawyer responded. The asset division took several months to work through. The Burlington house was sold. Market had softened slightly, but it still sold for considerably more than they paid, which meant there was equity to divide. Marcus got his share. Steph got hers. The $58,000 I had given them was documented in my revised estate plan as amounts to be reconciled against Steph's inheritance, not against Marcus, not as a claim I was making now, but as a record, an honest record. Patricia had advised me on how to structure it cleanly and legally, and I had. It didn't recover anything in the short term, but it made the truth visible in a document that would outlast all of us. I sat across from Steph one evening in September, after the separation papers had been filed and the worst of it had passed, and I told her about the changes to my will. Not everything, just enough. I told her I had restructured things after April. She was quiet. Then she said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because you needed to make your own decision. I didn't want you to feel like you were choosing between Marcus and an inheritance. I wanted you to choose for yourself." She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "I'm sorry I didn't say anything in the kitchen that day." I told her that trauma doesn't always look like what we expect it to look like. I'd done a lot of reading in those months about the way people freeze, about the way love can become a cage so gradually that you don't feel the bars until you try to move. I told her that I understood more than she thought I did. She reached across the table and took my hand. I don't have a tidy ending where everything is resolved. Life doesn't work that way, and I'd rather be honest with you than comforting. Steph is still in counseling. She's back in her own place now, a 2-bedroom apartment in Port Credit, not far from where we used to live when she was small, which feels like something. She and Marcus have no contact beyond what's required legally, and even that is mostly handled through the lawyers. He sent me one final message in October that I read once and then deleted. The literacy organization I'd supported for years received a named bequest in my revised will. Patricia says it's an unusual touch, but I like it. It matters to me that something I built over a lifetime goes somewhere that does good. Steph thought it was a nice thing to do. We talked about it over the phone on a Tuesday evening, and she laughed in her old way, that full, surprised laugh, and said I was sentimental underneath everything. She's not wrong. I'm 63 years old. I have a house in Mississauga that I've lived in for over 20 years. I have a good financial situation, adjusted but stable. I have a daughter who is, slowly and carefully, finding her way back to herself. I gave $58,000 to a marriage that nearly swallowed my daughter whole. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I say it as a fact. The money is gone. My daughter is not. The morning after I changed my will, I made tea and stood at my kitchen window watching the neighbor's dog investigate a patch of snow still lingering against the fence, and I thought about the word relevant. What Marcus had said to me in that kitchen, "You think money makes you relevant." I'd turned it over in my mind many times by then. He had it backward. The money was never what made me relevant. I was relevant because I showed up for 35 years through a rental duplex and night school and every hard winter and every broken thing. I showed up. No one gets to take that from me by jabbing a finger in my face. Not in my daughter's kitchen, and not anywhere else. Some things you have to decide belong to you. The showing up is mine. It always was. I think about that kitchen a lot. The way the light came through the window over the sink, the way my keys were sitting on the counter and I had to walk past them to get them. Small details that shouldn't matter but do, because the body remembers what the mind tries to soften. What happened to me didn't happen all at once. That's what I want people to understand. It accumulated. Each time I told myself Marcus was just stressed, just under pressure, just having a hard day, I was making a small choice. And small choices compound. I gave $58,000 over 2 years, not because I was foolish, but because I was operating on love without boundaries, and those are very different things. Generosity without clarity isn't kindness. It's an open door, and not everyone who walks through an open door deserves to be there. I've thought a lot about what it means to act with integrity when the people you love can't see what's happening clearly. Steph wasn't a bad person. She was someone who had been slowly persuaded over years that her mother was the problem. That kind of erosion is quiet and it is devastating, and I don't hold it against her. But I also couldn't let love for her become a reason to abandon my own judgment. When I sat across from Patricia in that office and told her I wanted to restructure my estate, I wasn't acting out of anger. I was acting out of honesty. The most honest thing I could do was make sure that what I'd spent a lifetime building reflected my actual values, not a version of my life that had been quietly rewritten by someone else. That took something I had to rebuild in myself. There's a kind of clarity that only comes when you stop waiting for other people to validate what you already know is true. I knew what I saw in Marcus's eyes that first time he told me to call ahead. I knew what I heard in Steph's voice when she said I'm fine and meant something else entirely. I knew, in that kitchen in April, that what was happening was not acceptable. The hard part wasn't knowing. The hard part was trusting myself enough to act on what I knew, even when my daughter was standing against the wall and not looking at me. Steph found her way back, not because I forced anything, not because I issued ultimatums or withheld love. She found her way because I kept the door open and kept myself honest and kept showing up in the ways I was able to. That is the only thing I know how to do. You cannot make someone see what they're not ready to see, but you can refuse to disappear while they're finding their way there. I'm 63 years old, and I have learned that the life you protect is built just as much from what you're willing to say no to as from what you give. The $58,000 is gone. I've made my peace with that. What I refused to give away was my own sense of what was real, and that, in the end, was the thing worth protecting most.